I'm sort of fascinated by this clip for a bunch of different reasons. Like, Stephen Miller's job seems to be to sign off on military attacks and to increase the number of immigrants that we're going to round up, develop bans on travelers from various countries, brown and black countries, and now also is an economics advisor. You'll recall that there's a bunch of provisions in the bill passed by the House as it heads to the Senate that are probably going to have to be stripped out because no parliamentarian would ever okay these. And even some in the House have complained about it. The contempt to get rid of like the judiciary ability to uphold contempt charges. One or two other, the AI regulation makes it very hard to argue that this is dealing with the budget. There are other rules for a reconciliation bill that hits the Senate. One of them is the Byrd rule, and that says that the deficit, and it's sort of complicated, but basically that 10 years out, just past 10 years out, the deficit cannot be increased beyond 10 years. And that is the reason why the 2017 Trump tax cuts, which were retroactive, I think, to 2016, will expire at the end of this year. And the way we have always calculated, at least in the Senate, whether something will contribute, a bill will contribute to the deficit on a 10-year horizon and make it eligible for reconciliation, is to calculate what the state of the law will be when this new bill gets enacted. And obviously, the tax cuts expire in 2026, the end of 2025, and that creates a new baseline of revenue that will come in to the U.S. government. Broadly speaking, if taxes are at 25% and they raise to 30%, you're going to get more revenue. All things being equal. These are all projections that are done by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. But the problem with that is that it means that Republicans, if they want to pass new tax cuts, need to find more cuts to our discretionary spending. And they don't want to do that because they want to raise defense spending, and they know that it's politically toxic for them to cut more and more things. And so they want to just pretend that the tax cuts are not being repealed. Now, the parliamentarian would have an issue with that, but the Republicans want to pretend like it's not a parliamentary question. It's just to be decided by the chair of the Finance Committee, and that would be, I think it's the Finance, or maybe it's Ways and Means, it's Lindsey Graham. And here is Stephen Miller being sent out to sell this idea to Larry Kudlow, who, back in the day probably would have pushed back on this, but he seems tired.
Reforms that we campaigned on. So let's talk about this. Extending and making permanent the 2017 tax rates does not and could not add to the deficit, because the job of the congressional budget keepers is to project what would happen under the normal course of business. And under the normal course of business, Larry, the tax that you're paying yesterday is the tax that you're going to be paying tomorrow. Just like the congressional budget office.
No, the normal course of business is to assume rightly that when tax cuts expire, they're going to return to the level that they existed before. If what he's deciding is normal course of business, that the tax cuts, the tax rate I have today will be the same tax cut as tomorrow,
then what's this for?
How can you justify tax cuts? That's not the normal course of business either. But so he's redefining what is a more of like a technical thing into some like vague colloquialism. No, everybody knows the tax cuts expire August 26. I mean, at the end of, prior to 26, at the end of this year. And but he's trying to argue that this is the same as there being no appropriations. We know the United States is going to pass a budget. We know that the government is going to do it, but we also know that the budget may change. And that's the point. It's not that there's not going to be any taxes or there's going to be 100% taxes. The question is, what's the number going to be? And we have a baseline and we have the bird rule.
Because the job of the congressional budget keepers is to project what would happen under the normal course of business. And under the normal course of business, Larry, the tax that you're paying yesterday is the tax that you're going to be paying tomorrow. Just like the Congressional Budget Office doesn't assume that federal appropriations go to zero next year just because all the money runs out in September. They project what it would be under the normal course of business. But here's what else is in the bill. The largest welfare reform in American history, Larry. Adding work requirements to food stamps and Medicaid. That is the single biggest welfare reform. It dwarfs, by the way, as excellent as it was, it dwarfs the welfare reform in the 90s. We're talking about saving $1.6 trillion by getting Americans into the productive workforce, lifting them up out of poverty, out of dependency, into independence. So again, what's in this bill? Tax cuts and reforms. American energy.
All right, so listen, they call it reform. It is cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. And we know we have two prime examples from Arkansas and from Georgia on what imposing these work requirements, so-called work requirements, will do. They will keep people who are eligible off the rolls, people who are working off the rolls because of all of the paperwork and whatnot. And the idea that these reforms are just about people who are not working and have no reason not to work is just absurd. And there is not a single expert who deals with this who believes any of what he is saying. And they know it.
They're lying throughout. They're lying throughout. They're saying we're not cutting Medicaid when we know that they are completely gutting Medicaid to pay for these tax cuts.
Millions of people throwing off insurance.
They're also going to eventually have to cut Medicare if this bill holds because of sequestration.
Yep.
Because of the automatic reductions due to sequestration, and that people are going to feel those effects. There's a chance that if this goes into effect, that you're going to see hundreds of rural hospitals. There's 200 that are at risk of immediate closure because of the cuts. But if these go through, you could see it happen and affect communities within the next year, because in a lot of these rural areas, the hospital is still 45 minutes away. What happens when there is no hospital an hour and a half, 2 hours away? It really is. The Alan Grayson, the Republican plan for your health care is get sick and die, or whatever he said back in the day.
Matt Brunig has a good, of the People's Policy Project. He calls Medicaid work requirements are cruel and pointless. He calls them paperwork requirements.
Exactly.
Oh, that's the other thing, the independence that he's talking about here.
A huge portion of people who work are on Medicaid because they're not making enough.
I mean, the top recipients of some of our social programs and are part of the working poor, people that work at places like Walmart and McDonald's. I think that there are, I'm forgetting the exact percentage, but there's some data on this that shows how many people are working. Yeah, on some of the top employers of people who are on Medicaid and food stamps work at Walmart and McDonald's. So there's what would make you more independent in a truly free society would be to not have to worry about your basic healthcare bankrupting you. That gives people actual independence and freedom, as opposed to the freedom of capital and capitalists to exploit you, which is what he's referring to.
Hell of a spokesperson for it.
I mean, charisma is off the charts, right? God. They should put him on TV more. I think
he's got a lot of extra time now. with
And
Mrs.
he's
Miller.
empty nesting, I guess.
Mrs. Miller.
Time to hit the gym and stuff.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, he's dressing like I started to dress after I got divorced.
Doing Stitch Fix now.
Yep.
So.
I don't know. I don't know if this kind of guy has like a productive breakup routine.
Well, no, I think we're
My guess is like, right. More hate to fuel his soul. That's what he needs, that vampire.
Labor Guy 420. Can I please get a shofar for my brother-in-law, Jess, who was one of the grand marshals of the Fresno Pride Parade this past weekend? He runs an amazing nonprofit called Gender Alchemy, where they focus specifically on trans issues, building community in the Central Valley. Love you all, and your commitment to these issues left is best. Scott 314, these tax cuts from 2017, I assume were set to expire this year in order to meet reconciliation or congressional budget scoring rules back then as well, right? Yes, that's how I started that. That's why it is 10 years out. They were explicitly because they did it under a reconciliation. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.